Welcome to our podcast, Psychiatric Services from Pages to Practice. In this podcast, we highlight new research or columns published this month in the journal Psychiatric Services. I'm Lisa Dixon, editor of Psychiatric Services, and I'm here with podcast editor and my co-host, Josh Berezin. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Lisa.
Today we have a treat. We're breaking it out of our 3-paper session mold, and we're going to be interviewing an author of a very cool paper.
Yeah, it's a great paper, and I think it's going to be a really good discussion, too. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Jonathan Purtle, an assistant professor in the Department of Health Management and Policy at Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University.
Good job.
I feel like we can just wrap it up now after that. Yeah. And he's here to talk about his article in this month's Psych Services, State Legislators' Opinions about Adverse Childhood Experiences as Risk Factors for Adult Behavioral Health Conditions. So welcome to the podcast, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited to have you.
Yes, just always excited to have authors, but I think both Lisa and I read your paper and were just very interested in it, thought it was a great topic and just a fascinating sort of line of research. And so we're going to get into that in a minute, but before we do, just as a way of introduction, maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about how you kind of got, what your line of research is and sort of how you ended up in this corner of services research.
Sure. So my training is in public health. So I have a master's degree in sociology because I like big picture stuff. I've always been interested in kind of society and influences of society on health and well-being. And then I kind of got into public health because I learned that public health was big picture like sociology, but about doing something at the end of the day and then about action. So my doctorate's in public health, and, during my doctoral training, and like lots of people's training, you kind of get hit over the head, especially in public health, with the importance of public policy and how policy shapes risk factors and opportunities for resilience, and how, policy is really a driver of a lot of health outcomes in physical health and mental health, of course, as well. So at some point, I got really interested in this idea of, well, okay, we know that policy is important. We have these social psych epi studies, telling us that policies are important. We know that, the field agrees that translating research to policymakers is a laudable goal. But I was really kind of struck with how do we do that? People are trying to do it, and that's great. But, if we value research and think that there can be value from systematically investigating something and measuring something and doing research, why not do research to try to figure out how to best influence policy with evidence? That's kind of where all my work is kind of culminates in that. People who care about creating policies that would be, put very broadly and plainly, good for mental health populations and help produce good outcomes in clinical settings. How can we help get those policies on the books?
Great.
Based on the evidence-based.
Yes, exactly.
That's exactly. Out there. And so this particular paper is about something that we have a pretty large evidence base about, which are ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I think a lot of our listeners, it's sort of been bubbling up, I think, over the past at least 5 years, more and more into a little bit more public consciousness. But can you just give a brief primer on ACEs before we get into what you looked at in the particular paper?
Sure. So the language of ACEs and quote-unquote adverse childhood experiences really came out of a seminal study, which was published in 1998 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And pretty much what they did was, in a large cohort of insured adults, largely middle-class adults in California, they asked them to complete a 8-item questionnaire about 8 things that may or may not have happened to them before the age of 18. And these 8 things were these quote-unquote adverse childhood experiences. So these included things like childhood physical abuse, childhood sexual abuse, neglect, but also things like having a parent be incarcerated, having a parent with a severe and persistent mental illness, having your parents be separated or divorced. And they admit they just kind of picked some things that they thought would have influence. It wasn't as rigorous as research often is. And they just looked at, what's the association between the number of ACEs that these adults reported, so just counting each one equally, adding them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, and their risk for mainly at first physical adult health problems as an adult. And they found this really strikingly strong graded relationship. So the more ACEs you had, the higher your risk. So the ACE study has been replicated in a whole bunch of different settings, looking at a whole bunch of different outcomes: mental health, physical health, health behaviors, social outcomes, outcomes related to financial stability as an adult. And, it's this pretty blunt measure, really. And again, the people who use it recognize this. It's just kind of, you're counting each one of these events as equal. You add them up. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. But in all these different settings, there are these strong graded relationships after you adjust for all the stuff you think would be confounders, where the more ACEs you have, the higher your risk. So that's kind of the adverse childhood experiences part of this and that language. And I think, the key with ACEs is it's this cumulative effect. So the more ACEs you have, the higher the risk. And this scoring of where there's a list of things, people retrospectively say how many of these things they had, and then that is the exposure. But while that's quote unquote adverse childhood experiences, and that is, maybe about a little over 20 years old is a thing at this point, the research about, childhood trauma and child abuse and child neglect and adverse health outcomes of adults and risk factors for mental health and substance use issues is much, much older and much, much more well established.
So we have this body of evidence, and you're really asking, how is this body of evidence, how do legislators, particularly state legislators, how do they see this body of evidence? How do they incorporate this body of evidence into their policy making?
Sort of. More or less, I think the key distinction was what I was interested in here is the extent to which their opinions about whether, or the extent to which these childhood experiences are risk factors for adult mental health and substance use issues, the extent to which their opinions are aligned with the evidence. So we could do and might do a separate study, which is more focused on if and how this evidence is informing their decision making and their concrete kind of what they're doing as a state legislator. And, are these issues on their agenda, on their policy agenda? Have they integrated this knowledge in legislative processes? This wasn't that. This was more kind of assessing alignment between what the epidemiologic research tells us and what they think, and kind of exploring the extent of that alignment and kind of how that alignment varies when you look at legislators with different characteristics.
So it's kind of what they've learned on their own and how they've, in some sense, how they've read the literature or the newspaper or kind of what's ambient in the culture about these very specific ACEs and their impact.
Exactly.
So walk us through kind of just the basics of the study design and what specific questions you were asking when you surveyed the state legislators.
Sure. So this survey of state legislators was conducted with funding from NIMH from a R21 I had to really, it's the first study to ask legislators anything really in kind of a large systematic way about their knowledge and attitudes about mental health and substance use issues. The and substance use part is because this was funded by NIMH, then the focus was really just on mental health at first. And we wrote our draft survey instrument, and then we did these cognitive interviews with former state legislators where we walked through the survey instrument with them and kind of, got a sense of were any questions unclear, or what were they thinking about when they read the question. And it became clear to us quickly, for legislators and I think the general public, mental health and substance use issues are kind of one and the same. They're distinct, but when they hear mental health, they're like, are you also talking about substance use or no? And it was really unclear. So we made that explicit in the survey that we were talking about both. So in future research, it'd be interesting to, just ask about mental health and substance use, and probably some of these opinions differ. But because it seemed ambiguous to them, we asked about both. I'll just say real quickly about the recruitment process. As you can imagine, it is hard to get legislators to complete surveys. And it has gotten much, much, much harder in the past 5 years. Response rates have plummeted. I think that's because there's a whole market around influencing legislators now, not just trying to get them to complete surveys, but it's, through email and social media. It's really easy to bombard them with information, so they are more bombarded than ever. But anyway, we had a nice budget for this, so we did pretty much everything we could do pay them to complete the survey, which we didn't do because most would not be able to accept an incentive. Turns out some actually could, but we know that most wouldn't, and we were afraid of scaring them away. In short, we mailed them a letter telling them we were going to send them a survey and recruit them to participate in the survey. We mailed them 2 post versions of the survey with postage paid returned envelopes. We emailed them about 10 times, and we called them about 10 times.
So if a legislator, full court press.
Yeah, if a legislator didn't complete the survey and didn't opt out, of course they could opt out, we contacted them 29 times over the course of 3 months. And the legislators, so we drew it was a random sample of state legislators. So what we did was we surveyed for our sample frame, we randomly selected up to 50 legislators from every state, excluding legislators who just came into office when we did survey recruitment. So we did the survey in January through March of 2017. So if you just came into office on January 1, 2017, we didn't recruit you. And our thinking being yes, you were technically a legislator, but you had so little time on the job at that point. We wanted people with, at least, a year experience. So yes, going back to the items, we asked these 4 items about 4 ACEs. And those ACEs that we asked about were childhood physical abuse, childhood sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, and childhood neglect.
And why did you choose those particular 4 out of all the
ACEs?
ACEs?
Totally. And this was a tough decision. We knew we couldn't ask about that many. So I think to us, childhood physical abuse and sexual abuse just seem like the ones that, anecdotally people, I think, generally get that those are problematic. So, we thought those would be kind of the ones where we would have, the most legislators saying, yes, these are major risk factors. And we did find that. And then we picked witnessing domestic violence and child neglect because they seem like the ones where, at a cocktail party, you're just talking to people, they would probably be surprised to learn that those things, most people, I think, would be surprised to learn that those things really do increase risk and or can be pretty detrimental. And when you look to the ACE evidence and the psych epi work, witnessing domestic violence is a pretty substantial risk factor for adult mental health and substance use issues, as is childhood neglect. So we kind of had these 2 usual suspects, if you will, that we thought that legislators would find as problematic and risk factors, and these 2 other ones that we kind of hypothesized would have lower levels of identification as being risk factors.
And so you also mentioned that you were looking at particular characteristics of the legislators. So what were those?
Yeah. So policymaking is political, of course, especially on the legislative side of things. So we knew their political party affiliation. So that was one variable. And then we asked them about their social and fiscal ideology separately. So these items have been used with the general public since the 70s. Actually, these well-established items, they're pretty simple, but apparently they're pretty telling. So we asked them about their social ideology, and that's just on a scale of 1 to 7. How do you usually think of yourself when it comes to social issues? And 1 being, I think it's extremely conservative, and 7, extremely liberal. And then we had the same question about fiscal issues. And so with this, we created a aggregate ideology score where we just kind of added up those 2 items, and then we had cut points, and we classified folks as ideologically liberal, moderate, or conservative. We knew the gender of each legislator, and we knew their state of residence. We knew if they'd been on health and health committees. And the other kind of key covariate in this analysis that we looked at was whether or not they had heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So as I said in the survey, we had these 4 items asking about perceived risk of 4 adverse childhood experiences. But then we wanted to know, in the childhood trauma world, everyone's talking about the ACE study and its importance of translating it to policymakers. Have folks heard of the ACE study? So we asked that too, and then we're curious, was that kind of driving our results? Was it if you heard of the ACE study, you thought all these things were risk factors, and if you hadn't heard of the ACE study, you didn't. We wanted to make sure we had the data point to allow us to look at that.
So what do you think that were the big findings, when you when you looked at kind of put all this together?
Totally. So a few things. So this wasn't really hypothesis-driven research. We'll call it hunch-driven research. But our hunches were true about kind of which adverse childhood experiences were perceived as kind of the biggest risk factors. So childhood sexual abuse, 77% of legislators identified that as a major risk factor. And then second was childhood physical abuse, with 59% of legislators saying that they perceive that as a major risk factor for adult mental health and substance use issues. And the two that we thought would have the lowest levels did have the lowest levels. So domestic violence, 39% of legislators saw that as a major risk factor, and for neglect, it was very close. It was 38%. So I guess one main finding was, we have this pretty substantial, epidemiologic evidence base about both witnessing domestic violence and childhood neglect and how they're risk factors. And it seems, this kind of signals to us that that legislators, they're not getting that, and maybe the public as well. But in terms of just, some evidence we may want to kind of push a little bit harder on to try to communicate and kind of convey some knowledge, I think it would be about the potential, both the risk that witnessing domestic violence and childhood neglect can confer on children for their adult well-being, and also, not just, we're not just trying to raise awareness about problems. We want to link that to potential legislative solutions. And I think,
Jonathan,
yes,
I think that what you say makes sense in terms of the two ACEs that were least endorsed as predictive of or associated with adult problems. But I have to say, I'm also taken aback by the fact that only 77% and only 59% understood that the most sort of, the conditions under which children have lived with sexual abuse and physical abuse, that wouldn't be 100%.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree. So it's interesting to think about what's going on there, right? And I think it's interesting to think, the extent, these questions were all anchored about risk for adult mental health and substance use issues. So the fact that, only 77% of legislators said that they thought that childhood sexual abuse was that, it might not be a reflection of them not thinking that childhood sexual abuse is really bad. It might be a reflection of how they think about the etiology of mental health and substance use issues. And maybe they think, it might be different. They might think, for example, mental health stuff is all genetic and totally predisposed. And they don't think that any social factor could influence risk for that because they see it as fixed. They could see substance use stuff as just individual choices and behaviors and not see any, they'd be totally in the dark about, the effect of social factors on risk for that. So I think that finding kind of, raises a lot of interesting questions about how legislators, and I think the general public also more broadly, really think about etiology in mental health and substance use issues.
Yeah, and the impact of one's childhood on one's adult life.
Exactly.
That also sort of brings up one of the other main strains of the paper is about how the characteristics of the legislators' ideology and also their party affiliation may have affected some of their opinions. So what did you find on that?
Yeah. So again, here our hunch was kind of correct, but kind of strikingly so. So for each one of these four ACEs, we found this graded relationship where liberals were most likely to identify each one of them as major risk factors, followed by moderates in the middle, and then conservatives, for all four having the lowest levels of identifying all four of these as major risk factors. So what's going on there? And I think, a way to think about it is like, why are the levels so low for conservatives? And this is all speculative, but here our thoughts are this. So one is maybe conservatives just like this evidence, this information is not reaching them. Maybe this is, circulating in liberal circles much, much more so than it is in conservative circles, which kind of has face validity and anecdotally makes sense. And there's some empirical grounding for that too. When we looked at that item where we asked legislators whether or not they had heard of the ACE study, the proportion was much higher among liberals and moderates than conservatives. So I think it was only 20% of conservatives had heard of the ACE study, where it was closer to 40% among liberals. So maybe it's just a knowledge deficit, right? We're pushing out, we being people interested in communicating evidence about childhood development, ACEs, to legislators, we're pushing this stuff out, but it's stuck in these liberal circles and it's not reaching the conservative legislators. That's one hypothesis, if you will. But I think it's also worth noting, the majority of legislators in our sample period, regardless of their ideology, they hadn't heard of the ACE study. So a lot of people, most people, and who completed our survey, were reading these questions and then just like, it's making, kind of, all right, I think this based on this. So, when we look to the kind of political science literature and this really interesting literature on political psychology and ideology, which I wasn't that familiar with, but started to get into a bit more, for folks who identify as conservative, they more strongly embrace kind of self-determination and are less likely to embrace ideas about external factors affecting someone's kind of individual outcomes, right? And in the public health world, when it comes to physical health and the social determinants of health, so the impact of, your income and your neighborhood characteristics and all that stuff on your physical health, we see that liberals are much more likely to endorse kind of broad structural social factors having influences on physical health than conservatives. And the reason there is this hypothesis that conservatives are just kind of more resistant to notions of kind of external things beyond the individual affecting the individual. So maybe that is driving some of the associations we saw, where conservative legislators, they might see these 4 ACEs as problematic. They might be things that they would still be all about, supporting legislation to prevent these things from happening. But when you frame the question in terms of, do you think this thing that happened to you in childhood can affect you as an adult, conservatives might just be less likely to embrace that notion generally.
And I think that's also where you're going with the study and your line of research, even, is like, how are we framing these questions and framing these issues so that it's going to be most effective? And I think one of the things I liked the most about your discussion was the section where you're just sort of talking about, like, does it really matter what the reason why somebody is supporting universal childcare or some policy that's like that? Like, do they need to know that they need to be doing it because of mental health and substance use outcomes? Yeah. Or if they're doing it for another reason, like, the point is to get them to do it. And it's not necessarily to get them to buy into this one particular idea.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point in the paper. I think it's in the limitations and in the limitations because it kind of undercuts the importance of the whole study. And I think rightfully so, right? Because like at the end of the day, we want there to be policies that, prevent exposure to ACEs and support resilience and cultivate protective factors. And we want policies that do that. How you get from A to B doesn't really matter. It's just about the B of having these policies on the books.
But wouldn't you say, Jonathan, that one way to get to B is to enhance understanding of what the evidence base is?
Yes, but what evidence base you draw from might vary upon who you're talking to, right? So I think let's just say, for example, if conservatives or a group of conservatives, let's say a class of conservatives, it is diametrically opposed to their core values to think that what happens to you as a kid affects how you do as an adult. And there is no way you're going to use this evidence to persuade them otherwise. And probably the harder you push on this, the more resistant they're going to become. For that group of legislators, I would say, all right, let's find a different strategy. Maybe they really care about workforce productivity. or cost in social service spending, frame it in a totally different way. So I think for some legislators, maybe a lot of legislators, educating them about the consequences of adverse childhood experiences and the opportunities to use legislation to prevent these experiences and mitigate their effects is an effective strategy. But for some, we might want to, pick a totally different course.
So it's sort of like differential therapeutics. We need to know what is necessary for whom, and then trying to understand what's going to influence them, and then prepare them with that kind of knowledge.
Exactly.
I think we were both curious also about, well, what's next for you? What's the next step in your research?
Yeah, totally. So I think, this R21, this survey has been really fruitful. We've learned a ton about just how different types of legislators think about mental health and substance use issues. So the next step is, developing an intervention, if you will, an intervention being a communication and dissemination strategy that builds on what we learned. And I think, that this could go a bunch of different ways. I'm really interested in, and the data support, what are the differences between kind of a one-size-fits-all communication dissemination initiative where you're just kind of all legislators are getting the same evidence regardless of their political party or ideology or state, versus kind of a more tailored strategy. So, a strategy tailored for liberals and a strategy tailored for conservatives.
Wouldn't it be cool if you could just do like a smart design where you have them at a computer, and then depending on how they answer, it'll take them down a specific path?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing we've thought of. So easier to do that with the general public, obviously, than legislators. But if we can, I think a question for us with our data and doing some public opinion research, which is easier to do than legislator research, really kind of empirically getting a sense of if and how legislators are different than the general public when it comes to mental health and substance use issues. And if they're by and large similar, maybe we can do some experiments with the general public and then extend those learnings to legislators. But the key difference for the key importance from my perspective is I really like questions about what legislators do in legislative processes, right? So what sorts of bills do they introduce? What influences what bills they introduce? There's no real corollary of that for the general public. But yeah, I agree, Lisa. A kind of smart design like that where you sit them down would be really cool.
Well, we are definitely looking forward to having you back on the podcast to talk about these next steps. You and Lisa can work on the smart design, and but thank you so much for coming. This is a fascinating conversation and a great paper, and we hope that everybody is going to read it, particularly if you're a state legislator.
Yes. Thank you both so much. It's been
Thanks,
a lot of fun.
Jonathan. Well, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the interview. We certainly did, and learned a lot, actually. It's always cool when you learn, when you read something, and then when you hear about it, you kind of, your brain wraps around it in a different way.
Totally.
So, it's fun to have Jonathan, and I think we're going to hear from him over the years. He's got a unique, penetrating question and the tools to answer these questions. We invite you to visit our website, ps.psychiatryonline.org, to read the article we discussed in this episode, as well as other great research. We welcome your feedback. Please email us at psjournal@psych.org. I'm Lisa Dixon.
I'm Josh Berzin.
Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.